Right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our third seminar of the year. Our first external speaker of the year, who I'm really excited to introduce you to. When we were putting together the program for this term, I was really excited to contact Eva and try and get her to come speak with us because Eva was one of the first lecturers I had in my undergrads, and I was like, she's really cool. I want to be cool like her, and it's part of the reason I'm doing my PhD today. So I thought I'd sneak in a bit of praise there. Apart from that, after Birmingham, Eva is a British Academy, I can speak, Postdoctoral Fellow in the History Department at UCL. Her research interests focus around modern cultural history, the history of museums, and the history of archaeology. And she's the author of Early Civilization and the American Modern, Images of Middle Eastern Origins in the United States, 1893 to 1939, and is the editor of the forthcoming Finding Antiquity, Making the Modern Middle East, Archaeology, Empires and Nations. And I'm going to leave it all up to you.
Thank you so much, Emma. I'm working on having shorter book titles in the future. Okay, thank you all for having me here, and I hope that this will be of interest to archaeologists as well as people who are interested in ancient history, hopefully relevant to at least how you think about your own discipline. Okay, so in 1923, the sculptor Lee Lowry created a panel of the history of writing for the Library of the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. While the scientists of the National Academy had strong opinions on the decorative program for their prestigious new home, the theme for the library's mantle was Lowry's own idea. And the content, I would argue, reflected an artist's bias. For in Lowry's account of the development of this essential science, writing begins as art. The earliest stage in his story is a Paleolithic cave painter, followed by an Egyptian carving hieroglyphic signs that are, of course, also in some sense pictures. Lowry's history proceeds upwards through Assyrians and Babylonians, Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans, to medieval monks, and finally the printing press. At the base, his early Egyptian carver works on an obelisk that breaks the bounds of the image. Finishing off the sign that Lowry himself has really carved. Is the carver not an analog, a double of the real artist? Lowry, a leading sculptor for important public buildings in the 1920s and 30s, would deploy variations on this canon in various other architectural projects. For the Sterling Memorial Library at Yale, he featured a Paleolithic cave artist in his paintings, Egyptian and Mayan hieroglyphs and their authors, as well as makers of conventionalized signs. For the 1926 Los Angeles Library, he created a well of scribes showing, to quote an official publication of the new library building, a group representing the European tradition. Confusingly, on the same side as two American figures, quote, Aztec with the symbol of the sun above his chisel, and the North American Indian painting his pictographs upon a skin. The traditions of the East, meanwhile, included, along with Egyptian, Chaldean, Phoenician, Chinese, and Arab, the primitive writer of the Old World, the Paleolithic artist with a saber tooth over his head, sketching his cave image of the mammoth. So a European inspiration, apparently at home with the Eastern script inventors. For the Library of Congress Thomas Jefferson Annex, Lowry created doors featuring 11 gods of writing, script, or wisdom from many cultures, and one real person, Sequoia, whose 1820 Cherokee syllabary merits his inclusion among a number of divinities. Lowry's works are striking examples of a style we now refer to as Art Deco. Lowry called his leanings simply modern. His understanding of the art of the modern involved an identification with the ancient past. In his own writings, he compared his work as an architectural sculpture to those of ancient sculptors, who he called the earliest of the architectural craftsmen, and whose approach to ornament he sought to emulate. Reflecting on his career towards the end of his life, in the late 50s, he drew that connection again. The ancients' work was for the glorification of their gods or their people, their country. While I have not been conscious of having a credo, I have felt a sculptor should reflect the stage of civilization at which we have arrived. So the idea I suggested that Lowry's ancient artists are stand-ins for himself then is supported by his own description of his responsibilities as an artist. His reference to the stage of civilization he worked in also reflects the same kind of historical consciousness that we see in that first sequence, in which historical development is progressive, with artistic expression related to something bigger, the growth of civilization, the rise of civilization. Yet we can also see throughout these schemes, I think, the difficulty of interpreting writing in strictly evolutionary terms. Its variety and the striking beauty of some of the earlier, more pictorial stages of writing inspire Lowry's images over and over again of the Paleolithic cave painter, the Egyptian and Aztec hieroglyphicist, and the American Indian picture writer. So in this talk, which had a very deliberately sweeping title, I want to look at big ideas through some small manifestations in the modern arts of the US. Starting with Lowry, I want to contextualize how these big ideas about the origins and development of civilization, writing, and pictures arose in scholarship, and how some artists working in their wake contributed to discourses about a rise of civilization through art and writing. I will ultimately suggest that, intentionally or not, these art interventions often serve to subvert the teleological progressive story of a uniform rise by suggesting a greater interest in or identification with and nostalgia for threshold places in that rise, points along the way rather than the alleged culmination in the Western present day. So I've started with these late examples from a public artist who explored writing and art in his own works, but I now want to backtrack to the 1870s and bring our story forward from there. On the way, we will explore the theories of two different big topics: the development of writing through pictures, or we might say of writing through art, and the development and elevation of public art as part of the architectural language of modernity, a means of communication that was direct and immediate in ways the ancients had understood and ways that were being recognized again. Lowry's depiction of writing that originated as art and his evolutionary framework can be traced back to the most influential American anthropologist of the 19th century, Lewis Henry Morgan. Morgan proposed a widely adopted three-part timeline for social development. Societies would pass through savagery, then barbarism, and finally achieve civilization. Each of these stages could be further subdivided by reference to various typological criteria. In Morgan's typological analysis of civilizations, picture writing was an intermediate stage, followed by hieroglyphic writing, identifying the typical origin of picture writing in the stage of lower barbarism, early barbarism. He noted that it was interesting as one of the stages of an art which culminated in the invention of phonetic alphabet. And he gives the sequence as follows. First, gesture language, or the language of personal symbols, picture writing, or ideographic symbols, hieroglyphs, or conventional symbols, hieroglyphs of phonetic power, or phonetic symbols used in the syllabus, and finally a phonetic alphabet, or written sounds. Since a language of written sounds was a growth through successive stages of development, the rise of its antecedent processes is both important and instructive, he said. Morgan did not expand much on writing as a technology, but many others who adopted his tripartite scheme did. Those adoptees included most American anthropologists and many ancient historians as well, not to mention social theorists around the world, including most influentially Friedrich Engels. So he was a very important thinker in the development of Marxism. Later commenters would disagree about precisely where picture writing and hieroglyphs must fall in civilizational development and in how much they differentiated between the two. But the idea that writing developed predictably and that its stage of development was an important marker of the stage of civilization the society had achieved was, I think we can say, axiomatic from the late 19th century through the period when Lowry created his various sequences of ancient writers. For many readers, the idea of a journey through picture writing to hieroglyphs seemed to suggest that all art was in some way related to writing, especially the art of pre-literate or non-literate people. Thus, the origins of art and the origins of writing were mutually relevant. Perhaps we could put it even more strongly and say that they had the same origin, the origin of symbolic communication, even of expressive thought. So we must pause to note a very strange assumption at the heart of Morgan's work. Morgan wrote his great book, Ancient Society, after carrying out field work among the contemporary Iroquois Confederacy. His sweeping claims about the ancient past were at least as much about his contemporary world, though he would not have seen it this way. His assumption was that Indigenous Americans offered a window onto the European past. This assumption and Morgan's framework undergirded other US anthropological projects, including efforts to document the picture writing traditions of different Indigenous groups in the Americas, who were usually described by anthropologists as occupying various stages of barbarism, the middle level of development. The most monumental such undertaking was carried out by Garrick Mallory under the auspices of the sweeping and very well-funded US Geological Survey, a federal endeavor. He published his study through the US Office of Government Printing, picture writing of the American Indians, referred to by him as a preliminary paper. The preliminary paper was 850 pages long of dense text interspersed with more than 1,200 figures. Nonetheless, it was indeed preliminary in that Mallory was mostly aiming to find and exegese the huge number of kinds of picture writing of North American Indians, taking in symbolic forms of communication ranging from gestures to petroglyphs to truly conventionalized signs, the origins, as he would have it, of true writing. Mallory organized these in various ways and commented on a wide range of interpretive matters, including through comparison, though never suggesting a direct relationship to numerous other script and idea systems. You can see him talking about cuneiform, for instance, here. Mallory's actually a rather delightful study takes the position that a huge range of symbolic forms of communication are mutually relevant. He would also carry out extensive research on gesture language, Morgan's very first stage in development of writing. Thus, physical sign language with the body, various kinds of pictorial representation, and conventional signs tending towards writing were all on a continuum, and all might help to explain each other. His cross-cultural comparison evinced minimal interest in hierarchy. Nonetheless, Mallory also followed the paradigm in which the visual was a crucial component in the development of writing, but where writing did have a natural progress towards the less pictographic. Drawing, he said, was the beginning of writing, and writing was a conventionalized drawing. All the known graphic systems originated in picture writing. All have passed through the stage of conventionalism to that commonly called the hieroglyphic, while from the latter, directly after an intermediate stage, sprang the syllabary, which used modifications of the old ideograms and required a comparatively small number of characters. So again, this evolutionary way of understanding things. So this paradigm of predictable evolutionary development of societies also informs psychological theories of individual development, notably those of G. Stanley Hall, a foundational figure in American psychology. For Hall, who drew also on the theories of German biologist Ernst Haeckel, and his principle famously summarized as ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, childhood psychological development involved a reiteration of the entire evolutionary history of humanity. Thus, society's evolutionary past was alive not only in stalled, primitive cultures of the modern world, as Morgan presumed, but also inside each individual as they grew up. Such a perspective might then seem to consign the visual to the childhood of humans and of humankind. Yet this was far from the only way that people were thinking about visual communication at the time. Many commentators across disciplines and political and social leanings also detected an elevation of visual communication in modernity. Sometimes this was linked to technological development, which made the visual both easier to produce and a better and more effective means of communicating with mass publics. Indeed, Hall declared in 1900 that we were all living in a picture age. Even aside from the technological innovations of modernity, however, many writers, psychologists and education professionals, museum curators and artists, all emphasize the inherent immediacy of visual communication, and the eye is an especially effective organ of perceiving and understanding. In 1889, G. Brown Goode, Assistant Secretary at the Smithsonian Institution and Museum Director at the U.S. National Museums, prefigured Hall's diagnosis of modernity as a picture age, writing, "In this busy, critical, and skeptical age, each man is seeking to know all things, and life is too short for many words. The eye is used more and more, the ear less and less. And in the use of the eye, descriptive writing is set aside for pictures, and the pictures in their turn are replaced by actual objects. In the schoolroom, the diagram, the blackboard, and the object lesson, unknown 30 years ago, are universally employed. The public lecturer uses the stereopticon to reinforce his words. The editor illustrates his journals and magazines with engravings 100-fold more numerous and elaborate than his predecessor thought needful. And the merchant and manufacturer recommend their wares by means of vivid pictographs." So I think it's interesting with this quote to see how some of these things sound like it could be someone talking about our culture now, and other things sound very funny, like the idea of the blackboard as this great innovation. Goode felt that public institutions had a responsibility to exploit the possibilities of visual communication as a means of education and uplift to which the democratic citizens of all classes were entitled. The elevation of visual communication and its democratic seriousness also applied to public art more broadly, not just in institutions with more obvious didactic purpose like museums. Starting in the late 19th century, and particularly over the course of the 1890s, art in public buildings, usually decorative sculpture like Lowry's later examples or wall murals, would become an increasingly important and widely publicized element of the American-built environment, whose commissioners and creators often spoke of its power to educate and elevate. The progressive era muralist Edwin Howland Blashfield, whose work we'll see in a moment, wrote of how, compared to hearing, the eye of man admits an even more immediate appeal. With the rude and uncultivated, the road to the mind from the eye seems still shorter than from the ear. A fact understood throughout the pre-modern world that was being relearned in modernity. In Antiquity, Blashfield said, the priest set up the artist as schoolmaster, and his school became the public building. Cass Gilbert, a leading classicist architect of the early 20th century, who designed numerous state capitals and the US Supreme Court, wrote of public art, "The poor man cannot fill his home with works of art. The state can, however, satisfy his natural craving for such things, and the enjoyment of which all may freely share, by properly embellishing its public buildings. There the rich and poor alike may find the history of the state and the ideals of its government set forth in an orderly and appropriate way, in noble inscriptions, beautiful mural paintings, and sculpture, and in the fine proportions and good taste of the whole design." In this formulation, written text and various kinds of visuals would work together to educate about history and ideology and spiritually elevate viewers. The sculptor Lee Lowry's reflections about the purpose of his art as something important, reflecting the achievements of the civilization he lived in, was an idea that was widely shared by colleagues creating public art and architecture in the decades he came up in. In US civic buildings in the 1880s and 1890s, we start to see a noticeable shift in decorative themes, from merely allegorical visuals or isolated scenes to schemes that privilege progressive and evolutionary narratives of human development. This reflected the ways that anthropological ideas had contributed to revising popular historical consciousness towards this evolutionary progressive vision of historical change. This understanding of history as a teleological narrative, the rise of civilization, also reflected and contributed to later 19th century boosterism for the benefits of progress and modernity. Grand public buildings were often concrete embodiments of modernizing agendas. Public libraries, for example, which were built in huge numbers from the 1890s across the US, were lauded for their democratic openness to all, educating and uplifting citizens, just as Good has argued that museums should also do. An emblematic example of the democratic public library, whose art exemplified the evolutionary vision of history, was the 1897 Library of Congress, the nation's public library, an enormous ornate neoclassical structure built, of course, with federal funds as well. In keeping with the norms of progressive era civic architecture, the building was adorned in every possible blank space with elaborate paintings and sculptures, allegorical and historical, reflecting anthropological and historical theories of human civilization. Most infamously, this included a series of heads ringing the exterior of types of different races arranged in a hierarchical order, culminating in white Northern European. The Smithsonian's curator in ethnology, Otis P. Mason, oversaw the accuracy of the skull measurements of the artist's sculptures. Perhaps the most significant work for the library was the mural adorning the collar and dome of the main reading room, Edwin Howland Blashfield's The Evolution of Civilization. Personified civilizations of the world each offer some unique contribution to the overall development of world civilization, culminating, of course, in the United States, which offers science. And this figure here was based on the face of Abraham Lincoln, but very buff Abraham Lincoln. At the very beginning of civilization's evolution is written records, an invention which is assigned to ancient Egypt. This accords with orthodox Morganism, in which hieroglyphic, rather than mere picture writing, is the absolute bedrock of the civilized stage of human development, the point where things tip over. The building also celebrated the development of writing in several other commissions. Bronze lunettes for the exterior door depict, to quote the official handbook, the successive and gradually more perfect ways in which mankind has preserved its religion, history, literature, and science. This is the 1897 handbook. Tradition, writing, and printing. The development of writing emerged from pre-literate ways of passing on memory, tradition, and ultimately culminated in the technology of mechanical reproduction, according to this. Similar ideas were represented in John White Alexander's Evolution of the Book, a 5-part mural sequence, beginning in prehistory with the cairn, showing prehistoric men lightly clad in animal skins, raising a memorial of heaped stones by a seashore. Like Garrick Mallory, for whom gestures with the body were parts of picture writing, Alexander is here according any kind of symbolic communication a place in the genealogy of the book. Next in order is oral tradition, showing an Arabian storyteller captivating his fellow tribesmen. The era is unclear. And then Egyptian hieroglyphs, depicting a male carver watched by a passive woman spectator. The handbook informs us she is his sweetheart. In this case, the era can be pinpointed more precisely as sometime in the roughly 3,000 years that hieroglyphs were in use, perhaps most likely sometime in the Pyramid Age in the mid-3rd millennium BCE. This is followed in time by one called picture writing, thus reversing the order that Morgan would have accorded these two stages and showing how these ideas were sometimes received rather vaguely. Here we see once again a male artist-writer, an indigenous American preparing to paint on a prepared hide, while once again a beautiful girl passively watches. The era again is unclear, but I think we can imagine that we're looking at a scene set much more recently than the Pyramid Age, informed as it is by the kind of contemporary field work the federal government was sponsoring at the same time they were sponsoring this library building. The final two images show a European monk creating a manuscript book, and Gutenberg himself and his assistant with their printing press, his assistants. Both sequences illustrate how an evolutionary schema could easily tell a seemingly coherent narrative of a rise of civilization, even at the same time that it jumps around in time and space, creating hierarchies of peoples in the process. 5,000-year-old Egyptians are somehow the same as indigenous Americans, or almost the same, just a few hundred years ago, among other reasons because of what kind of writing they do or don't use. We can see this logic in a particularly striking way if we turn back to the tradition lunettes, which the official 1897 guidebook describes as featuring a landscape background of prehistoric vastness and solitude, with typical representatives of the primitive peoples whose entire lore was kept alive by oral tradition. Who they describe as an American Indian, a Norseman, a prehistoric man, and a shepherd, standing for the nomadic pastoral races. The face of the Indian, the official guidebook noted, is understood to be a portrait of Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce tribe from a sketch made from life by Mr. Warner in 1889. Chief Joseph was the English name of Hinma Tuyalatket, who, after leading his people in resistance to relocation onto a reservation, had ultimately surrendered to the US Army in 1877. We might pause to wonder what a man available as a life model is doing in a setting of prehistoric solitude, but for the author of this guidebook, his presence there needs no further justification. While there are stark differences between the maximalist aesthetic of the Library of Congress and the strict classicism of the National Academy of Sciences, between the naturalistic bronzes and murals of the former and Laurie's stylized light relief in that history of writing mantle, it should be easy to recognize a common vision of history and the evolutionary narrative of writing's development, and with it of human societies. In both sequences, writing begins in prehistory, before the picture writing or hieroglyphic phase with some kind of symbolic art. Yet the Library of Congress, or in Laurie's case with symbolic art, the Library of Congress sequences, despite themselves being visual art, emphasize what I think we might call a verbal or linguistic take on this, highlighting the origin of writing in storytelling and oral communication. Laurie, in contrast, locates the earliest prehistorical phase of writing in the visual, in cave painting. Laurie's elevation of the Paleolithic cave painter owes something to the works of Henry Fairfield Osborn, elected a member of the National Academy of Sciences in 1900. Osborn was a vertebrate paleontologist, initially specializing in ancient mammals, but by the time he became president of the American Museum's Board of Trustees, the American Museum of Natural History in New York in 1908, his interests had shifted to human origins. In Osborn's best-selling 1915 popular book, Men of the Old Stone Age, the heroes were the Cro-Magnons, whom he portrayed as noble artistic geniuses, a foil to the bestial, crude Neanderthals. The Cro-Magnons' overwhelming art impulse was proof of unity of heredity and the significance of innate racial characteristics. It is something which could not pass to them from another race, like an industrial invention, but was inborn and creative, he wrote. Osborn accorded this race of artists the highest compliment he could offer. These people were the Paleolithic Greeks. Artistic observation and representation and a true sense of proportion and of beauty were instinct with them from the beginning. On the book's title pages, these upper Paleolithic artists were credited alongside the contemporary paleo artists who worked with him at the American Museum and earned the collegial expression of gratitude and acknowledgments that otherwise include fellow contemporary scientists. He also wrote, "It is a unique pleasure to express my indebtedness to the upper Paleolithic artists of the now extinct Cro-Magnon race, from whose work I have sought to portray, so far as possible, the mammalian and human life of the Old Stone Age," he wrote. So he's sort of treating them as scientific illustrators. The exhibits at the American Museum's Hall of the Age of Man reflected Osborn's vision of the sensitive artist Cro-Magnon. As Victoria Kane and Marion Summer have explored, Osborn was a significant advocate for the kind of visual education that G. Brown Goode had identified as a necessity in the museums of the future way back in 1889. Osborn made that a reality at the American Museum, where he oversaw dynamic reconstructions of dinosaurs, animals, and humans. For his Hall of the Age of Man, he worked with his favorite paleo artist, Charles R. Knight, on 3 murals that would capture different phases of human evolution. For Osborn, who hosted the 1921 International Congress of Eugenics in the newly opened hall, these images of humanity's past were intended to reify racial hierarchies, illustrate the absolute separateness of human races, and the importance of race in determining character. The Cro-Magnon was depicted in visuals at the museum very differently than the Neanderthal, not only by Knight here, but also in scientific skull reconstructions that you see back here. This is the Cro-Magnon by J. Howard McGregor, where he was a handsome, familiar individual in comparison to the Neanderthal. And you can also see the Piltdown man here, who was later blacked out with a black box from later versions of this photograph in their archives. So, Osborn's admiration for the Cro-Magnon elevated a period that, according to his own evolutionary theories of development, was a liminal intermediate stage and not the peak of human development. This was especially the case for Osborn, who did not believe that the Cro-Magnons had any direct relationship to modern humans, but were an evolutionary dead end, something we now know not to be true. Osborn commissioned Knight to depict 3 stages of early humans, including his direct ancestors, these guys, the early Stone Age man. Osborn also believed that these people were only the direct ancestors of Nordics like him or like Knight. Yet, in Charles R. Knight's realizations of these scenes, the Cro-Magnons are the only early humans who he imagines doing exactly what he does, creating wall paintings of animals. He was otherwise an artist of animal and dinosaur images. Knight had, by the 1920s, come to consider himself important enough to serve as a real collaborator, his imagination and skill offering real contributions to scientific knowledge. I see his own interests at work then in this image. Osborn and Knight agreed that cave art was not merely evidence of a complex symbolic system in the very deep past. It was also evidence of a well-developed aesthetic sense, and quite simply, good art. It holds true in contemporary museums, the importance of the aesthetic. The American Museum's current exhibition on human origins, very different though it is from the 1920s one, still speaks of prehistoric art with the rapturous language of the connoisseur. Labels note its remarkable precision and grace and praise magnificent cave paintings. Creating and appreciating art, their exhibition's introductory text tells us, is one of the answers to the question the gallery poses: what makes us human? In the 1920s, these aesthetic judgments risked unsettling the entire premise of evolutionary history and its idea of a gradual development towards something better. Perhaps the past had produced, if not more technologically or spiritually or intellectually advanced civilizations, more aesthetically advanced ones. The emphasis on the visual that was re-emerging in modernity was perhaps a reawakening of something that had already been there, maybe even been better in our evolutionary past. From an artist's perspective, while cave painting, picture writing, and hieroglyphs were supposed to be intermediate stages on the way to a better form of communication, and with a better form of civilization, they certainly made for more compelling subjects than conventionalized writing. Certainly Gutenberg or medieval monks seem to lead to less interesting and less dynamic representations in the examples we've looked at. In their images of artists, writers at work, artists like Knight, Lee Lowry, and John White Alexander imagine the moment of creation, zero in on a liminal space of potential. Perhaps nowhere is the powerful potential of ancient art imagined in the moment of its creation better captured, I think, than in works by a painter of the progressive era, George de Forest Brush, whom I want to end with. Brush's paintings are a little different than the previous examples because they were not public or decorative art. They were not linked to spaces with civic or didactic purposes. But Brush too wrestled with questions about the purpose of art in the world he lived in and its relationship to a wider public. For instance, he exhibited paintings at major world's fairs, including the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition, an event that celebrated America's exceptional place in the history of civilization and attracted enormous crowds to its pavilion of fine arts. Brush's great subject throughout his career was contemporary American Indians of the continental United States, but he also created a few images of Mesoamerican scenes, one of which I want to look at here. In 1887's An Aztec Sculptor, he depicts the eponymous artist at work at some point in the classical period. Brush's sculptor is a solitary figure in the early stages of inscribing low relief drawing images and hieroglyphic text into a stone wall. In Brush's image, his sculptor has blocked out the spaces where his hieroglyphs will go, but he's only begun to fill in a few of them. This is a plausible reimagining of the process of complex carving. Showing this work in an intermediate state highlights the power of the artist-writer. Through his solitary hand, stone can become image and blank spaces filled with meaning. The images he creates will and have outlasted him. Brush can create such a painting because the kinds of Aztec and Mayan art and signs he shows being created still exist. So this is actually maybe a bit more informed by Mayan hieroglyphs and art. Given that Aztec glyphs and Mayan glyphs were essentially undeciphered at the time that Brush created this image is also, though, frustratingly, tantalizingly opaque. The artist's face is turned away from us, a device that both invites us into his activity and perspective, and yet also distances us from this creator, just as the unfinished image denies us the knowledge of what the stone will soon show. Yet we must also consider that all of this is an illusion. There is no stone, carved or uncarved. There is only Brush's oils. Through his own creativity and technical skill, he can evoke other materials and other styles of artistic expression, capturing, reproducing the aesthetics of Aztec or Mayan art, as well as his own 19th century naturalism, his carefully observed anatomy and soft light of the interior space. This painting was one of a number of works by Brush showing indigenous craftsmen at work. Scholar Emily D. Shapiro has argued that his interest and identification with native craftsmen was rooted in his profound antagonism toward modern industrial society. Brush both identified with these pre-modern, and in anthropological terms, not yet quite civilized artists, and envied them for working in a pre-modern context that he might prefer to the state of civilization in which he was working. Is that my last slide? Yeah. Okay, I started by exploring scholarly theories about the important role of the visual in the development of writing, with the visual as the transitional moment on the way to culmination in civilized non-pictorial writing. But we have seen how various artists and academics wanted to dwell in that transitional space, to think about different kinds of memory marking than the written text, and different ways of communicating, through pictures or picture writing or something in between. The hierarchies that were created by the evolutionary theories around the development of civilization did not in fact focus attention on the alleged culmination, but on these transitional moments, which may have been, within such schemes, less advanced, but were often clearly understood by people who engaged with them as more beautiful, more interesting, or maybe more likely to value a skilled artist or craftsman, or to offer the person who could make beautiful images a central role as a memory keeper and meaning maker in their culture. These transitional moments may also have captured a kind of visual communication that was uniquely suited for the modern age, something between text and image. This communication also might strike modern viewers in a way that ancient texts could not, appearing legible at first glance, even if, as scholars of the ancient world, we know that this legibility is often itself an illusion. It has long been observed by scholars of reception that the reception of the ancient past is not merely about the reflection or reinterpretation of something from antiquity, but part of the shaping of that something, an interactive process. Likewise, the reception of scholarly theories in popular spaces or in the arts is not a one-way street. The works I've explored do not merely reflect academic ideas about the development of writing and image, but form part of the development of those ideas. In particular, attention to the aesthetic qualities and to the beauty of certain ancient images or texts has affected how they are interpreted by scholars, not to mention how they are presented to the public in museums. In a forthcoming book, my colleague at UCL, Alice Stevenson, notes how an aestheticization of Egyptian artifacts has shaped the kinds of questions curators and researchers ask, including whether artifacts are researched for what they tell us about Egyptian life and thought, whether we ask questions about how they were used, or whether they are assessed for formal qualities. And she also talks about how contemporary art can change those kind of questions. The importance of our subjective aesthetic sense is, I think, especially clear in the case of cave painting, where the fact that art is considered good art contributed to a rethinking of the humanity of early humans. Recent work on Neanderthal art makes this very clear, and not just in these articles for popular media, but in the very fact that these are questions we want to ask, that it matters to us whether Neanderthals made art. We might no longer speak of a teleological rise of civilization, but we still think that the origins of art or writing tells us something about how closely we might identify with peoples of whatever species in the past. In the epilogue of my book, which I'm closing with a plug for, and in my forthcoming book, which I'm also plugging here, that will be available in March 2025, I think about some of these questions in the intro for this edited volume. So I found myself quite compelled by these very different topics that are covered in these two books to raise similar questions, though. Why can't we let go of the significance of origins? What would it mean to stop seeking answers about them and stop seeing something about ourselves and our destinies reflected in the peoples we imagine ourselves into in the past? I don't have answers to that question, so I'm going to close this talk by leaving them open for you to think about further as it might apply to your own work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was great. I open the floor to any questions in the room. Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really interesting and not something I'd come across at all. I'm just wondering, I couldn't help thinking when you were, I think it was one of the early slides, you talked about savagery, barbarism, and then civilization. I couldn't help sort of reflecting that there is a sort of trend in the 19th century to view civilization as a sort of double-edged sword. It's good and bad. Do we have any sort of idea that actually the invention of writing is not something that's good, but sort of in some way bad, and you're losing some of the virtuosity of savagery in the 19th century? Does that come across at all?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So something I didn't have time to elaborate on, but that's really relevant to all of this is the things I talked about with Brush, of him having this sort of nostalgia for a better kind of production that happened in pre-civilized cultures, is part of a much wider trend in the late 19th century that's happening at the same time that you have this like boosterism for progress, which some people have called anti-modernism, even though a lot of the works that promote anti-modernism are by people we think of as modernists, but a kind of nostalgia for the archaic, or an idea that the archaic, the pre-civilized was purer, better, stronger, more interesting. So there's an excellent book by Kathy Gear called Knossos and the Prophets of Modernism, which looks at how the site of Knossos inspired these sort of modernist thinkings about the archaic, and people seeing, you know, peaceful matriarchal cultures in Knossos. But you also get, you know, fascists who think that men were men and men were stronger. And you also get like guys who want to weave baskets, who think that weaving baskets was better than things that are produced in factories. So yeah, these ideas, I think, as we can imagine from our own culture, that you kind of always have competing ideas. So, you know, often held by the same people, kind of depending on what they're talking about or where they are in their life, that at the same time that you have these ideas about a rise of civilization, you also have fears about what civilization does to people. Also late 19th century fears about diseases of civilization, degeneration, that civilization leads to a kind of decay in humans and in society. So yeah, I think that informs some of this kind of nostalgia. And maybe you get people who are nostalgic for the most basic forms, people who want to be naked on an island. But you also get people who are maybe as nostalgic for something that's like a little bit different, the world just before you had railroads or factories or whatever. The long answer to your question.
Thank you for a really interesting presentation. Going back to some of the kind of these academic theories of, I think it was the 30s, but maybe a bit earlier as well. It's very interesting, he's kind of seeing this progression that's being outlined of different forms of representation.
Mm-hmm.
But I was curious if there's much focus in these works about what is being written, because obviously it seems like there's an implicit assumption in a lot of what you're talking about that writing or symbolic representation in general has something to do with the artistic or the aesthetic. Is there any mention in this academic theorizing of, say, mundane writing, like the writing of bureaucracy?
That's really interesting question. Because something that we now know is that actually in the places where writing is invented, it's invented separately, multiple times in human history. There are actually very different ways that it develops and different reasons it's invented. I am most familiar with cuneiform, which is invented via very sort of boring bureaucratic documents. That's what people are recording. And that is generally not what people are talking about here. They are talking about representing a sort of thought, representing culture, the gods, their ideas about the world. So I think that people are maybe not paying attention always to the specifics, or they're seeing what they want to see. So you can also think about the way that like hieroglyphs, I'm just going back to this, that they're all like exciting images here. And the way that hieroglyphs were often interpreted as being kind of mystical. So before people understood hieroglyphs, one theory was that they were this like mystical writing. But the idea that these beautiful pictures of like birds and gods and animals and humans were actually just ways of recording very mundane things is kind of unexciting.
Thank you.
But the presentation was great, and similar. I thought about it this based on the previous question. So then, given that the general idea of most of those paintings was that writing developed from like kind of aesthetically like either through from storytelling or from just creating symbols.
Mm.
Could it be that then the idea from the 1870s to the 1930s, at least maybe not before or later, could it be that it's an overemphasis on hieroglyphics, on Egyptian hieroglyphics and the Greek alphabet, seeing as hieroglyphics and pictographs were, even if the meaning is pretty mundane, they look aesthetically pleasing, so they seem to have a lot of symbolic meaning, even if they don't.
Yeah.
And then when the Greek alphabet, when it first appears in the mid 8th century, we see it's already fully developed because we don't have the earlier stages where it's just the first the first administrative records.
Yeah.
So then, could that be why there's sort of that emphasis on it all beginning because to reflect on to express symbolic ideas?
Yeah, well, so I have recently, last month, I was at a conference of this project in Cambridge, the Views project. Do people know this project? Visual interactions of early writing systems. I was talking about similar things. Most of the people there are working, you know, on script decipherment or script creation. There were a lot of people who were working on like modern neo-scripts. And the point of this project, it's a follow-up to a first project that was like critical something records, early writing systems. That wasn't about the visual, but now this project wants to look at like, what is the visual nature of writing, not just early writing, but all writing. So I think you can't deny that like there is this relationship between art and writing. But from what I know about different script systems, that relationship is really different in different cultures. So you actually can't come up with this typology that applies everywhere. But yeah, in Egypt, you do have, I think, a lot more interaction between art and writing than you usually have in Mesopotamia, although you do get those interactions. And the fact that hieroglyphs are very enchanting, Egyptian hieroglyphs are very enchanting, maybe has sort of swayed what people expect to find in that regard, because it's sort of the most popular kind of system.